So, what if you could tell your social media feed not just what you want to see, but what you actually value? And I'm not talking about liking more puppy videos to get more puppy videos. No, we're talking about a total shift in how our online world gets curated, moving beyond just, clicks and engagement to something way more personal. All right, let's get into it.
Here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll talk about the problem with the current one-size-fits-all feed that pretty much everyone has. Then, we'll dive into this pretty radical idea of ranking all that content by human values. We'll break down the toolkit that actually makes this possible, see how it did in a real-world test, and, most importantly, hear what users had to say about it. And finally, we'll zoom out and look at what this all means for the future of our feeds.
To really get why this is such a big deal, let's start with a feeling I bet is super familiar to most of us when we're just mindlessly scrolling.
You know the feeling. You're scrolling, and it just feels off. You're being shown stuff that's supposed to be for you, but it doesn't really connect with who you are or what you actually care about. Well, if you feel that way, you're not alone. And it turns out there's a pretty good reason for it.
See, the root of the problem is that there's usually just one single algorithm making decisions for millions, sometimes billions, of incredibly different people. And that centralized control leads to all sorts of issues, right? Concerns about bias, censorship, rules that seem to be enforced one day but not the next. It just can't possibly meet everyone's unique needs. So what do? We're forced to come up with what researchers call folk theories, our own little tricks and workarounds to try and game the mysterious algorithm into showing us what we actually want.
But what if you didn't have to try and trick the algorithm? What if you could just tell it what matters to you? This is where we get to this really radical new idea. Just look at this slide. It shows the whole concept perfectly. We're looking at the exact same collection of posts, but they're sorted into totally different ways. On the left, you've got a feed that's been told to prioritize posts about achievement and dominance. On the right, that same group of posts is completely reshuffled to prioritize humility. This is the whole idea in a nutshell, giving you control over the basic principles that organize your world online. And this isn't just some cool feature idea dreamed up in a boardroom. It's actually grounded in a whole field of study called value-sensitive algorithm design. And the main idea is pretty simple, but it's also really profound. It says that when we build these incredibly powerful tech systems, we have to consciously think about human values, what people actually consider important in life. So, how on earth do you translate something as messy and complicated as human values into ones and zeros an algorithm can understand? Well, let's pop the hood and look at the toolkit these researchers put together. Everything is built on this foundation right here. It's a psychological framework called Schwartz's theory of 19 basic human values. The best way to think of this wheel is as a map of human motivation. Values that are neighbors, like tradition and security, they go together pretty well. But values on opposite sides of the circle, like power and universal concern, well, they're in conflict. This map is what gives the algorithm its language. And to make this a little less abstract, just look at how these values create these natural tensions. A value like hedonism, which is all about excitement in new things, sits directly opposite from tradition on the wheel. And in the same way, caring, which is a value focused on others, is in tension with achievement, which is all about focusing on yourself. It's these built-in relationships that let the system understand the nuances of what makes us tick.
So how does this work in the real world? It's basically a two-step process. First, an AI reads every single post and gives it a score for all 19 of those values. Then, and this is the cool part, you get a set of sliders. You can crank up the values you want to see more of and dial down the ones you're not so interested in. It's kind of like being a DJ for your own feed, mixing the content based on your personal vibe.
Okay, this all sounds really fascinating, but the million-dollar question is, does it actually work? Can people even tell the difference when it's happening? Well, the researchers decided to put it to the test. The experiment itself was pretty straightforward. They showed users two feeds right next to each other. One was just the standard feed, and the other was custom-tuned to a specific value. And the question was, could people actually feel the difference? And the answer was a big, clear yes. Over 3/4 of the time, 77.4% to be exact, people correctly picked out the value-tuned feed. That's a huge signal. It means the effect isn't just some abstract theory. It creates a different experience that you can actually feel. But, of course, it's a little more complicated than that, and this is where you start to see the challenges. Some values are way easier to spot than others. Feeds that were ranked for dominance, people spotted those with 100% accuracy. It's a pretty strong signal. But a more abstract value, like interpersonal conformity, which is basically about not rocking the boat,
That was much, much harder for people to see. Less than half could spot it. So beyond the stats, the researchers really wanted to understand the human side of things. What was it actually like to use this kind of tool and to think about your feed in this completely new way?
One of the first things they found was that classic paradox of choice. I mean, the power to control all 19 values sounds amazing, but for some people, it was just too much. As one user put it, there were simply too many options to choose from, and it just led to this feeling of being overwhelmed.
Now, this quote from a user reveals something so important about this whole problem. This person cares about a topic, but they're hesitant to boost it in their own feed. And why? Because they know how toxic the conversations on the platform can get. They want to see content that aligns with their values, but only if the discussion around it can be constructive. It just goes to show that this isn't only about the content itself, it's about the whole context of the conversation. So when the researchers boiled down all this feedback, a few key things really stood out. People felt these controls would be way more useful for a personal account than for, say, a professional one. They especially wanted this kind of power for those algorithmic feeds, like a For You page, but they didn't really see the need for it on a simple chronological feed of people they already follow.
Okay, so let's take all of this, the tech, the data, the human side of it, and ask, what does it all mean for the future? Where could this all be heading? This really gets to the heart of the matter. If we give people this much power to tune their feeds to their specific values, are we helping them break out of their echo chambers, or are we just handing them a brand new shovel to dig even deeper bubbles? Not just bubbles of topics, but bubbles of core values.
Now, you might think this would just lock us into our bubbles even tighter, right? But the research actually suggests it could do the opposite. It could help puncture filter bubbles. The idea is that you might be more open to hearing a different point of view if it's framed in a way that connects with a value you hold deeply, like caring or responsibility. Your values could become a bridge to topics you'd otherwise just scroll right past. Ultimately, we could be moving away from a world where we're just passive consumers of whatever an algorithm serves us to one where we can be active architects of our own online experience. And that leaves us with one final thing to think about. If you had those sliders in your hands, what would you turn up? What would you value most?